Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Freedman, and I'd like to welcome you to this educational program examining how asset control and seizure-like state actions are becoming normalized tools of economic statecraft. I've worked as an international correspondent for more than 30 years and have written about trade for several media organizations, including Bloomberg News, MLex, and Borderlex. This educational program is presented in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, and the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA is solely responsible for the development of the content of this program. We're here today with Shannon Brandau, author of the white paper called Navigating the New Age of Geopolitical Asset Seizures. Shannon will tell us a bit about her paper, after which I'll ask a few questions and then take some questions from you, our audience members. Welcome, Shannon. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for showing up. So I'm going to start my initial remarks with just a small slideshow to help you understand this quite complicated topic that I've been writing about and researching. And so let me just share my screen. Here we go. Okay, can you do you see just the presenter view or are you seeing more than that, Jennifer?
Seeing you and me and your slides.
Only the
So,
slides.
yeah.
Okay, that's what I've got then. Excellent. All right. So I have written a white paper for the Hinrich Foundation entitled The New Age, sorry about that, entitled The New Age of Geopolitical Asset Seizures. Why me? I am a law and geopolitical analyst. I focus on international business law and national security. I specialize, though, however, in China regulatory and political risk. In 2021, I founded a weekly newsletter called China Boss News, and that's over at Substack. I also maintain a very regular news feed. It's regularly updated. I post and repost material frequently every day on LinkedIn. So if you go to either of those, you'll find a lot more information about these sort of topics if that's what you're interested in. I also welcome your questions after this program. If there's something that you've read in the paper that you were thinking about asking and then you weren't sure and then you decided you had a question, please feel free to contact me. I'm easier to reach on LinkedIn, but you can also contact me at Substack. Next slide. Okay. So, the new age of geopolitical asset seizures. In a nutshell, my paper argues that asset seizure is becoming a normalized economic a piece of normalized economic statecraft. I'm arguing that it is different, however, than what most people think of as asset seizure. So, the asset seizure that I discuss is a slightly more limited legal approach, meaning there's no outright confiscation, there's no nationalization. Ownership remains firmly with the private owner, but the state will intervene in a way as to remove control over the asset from that owner. And so what happens is the effect, even though nominally it's not an outright confiscation, it's not a nationalization under the black letter law, but the effect is, for the most part, the same. There is a trend that I have identified that is structural. And what that means is this is not a one-off, but a deeper and lasting change in how governments are managing their economic and national security risks. This trend is cross-regional. It's taking place not only in the USA, but it's also taking place in jurisdictions across Europe and in Asia. Just a quick note before I switch slides. If you haven't been able to download this paper, you can get it at the Hinrich website. You just go to the search bar and you type in the new age of geopolitical asset seizures, it will pull the paper up. But you will need to enter your email address to download the entire paper on PDF. If you don't, what you're going to see is just a summary, not the paper itself. If you have trouble, I think some people had trouble getting that PDF. If you have trouble, just contact me. I will be happy to send you a copy. Okay, moving on. So, about this structural shift, we're going to talk more about that a little later. However, there are a number of drivers that are easily recognizable in today's very volatile geopolitical climate, and that is a repoliticization of the supply chains. There is a greater willingness for governments to maybe step across the traditional market state boundary and intervene in ways that they haven't in ownership. And there are an increasing number of seizure tools, whether they are ex ante, which is legislating before the actual controversy, or ex post, legislating after someone has already invested in the asset, and all of a sudden they see their rights to that asset curbed. The governments that I researched were placing a lot more emphasis on a concept of resilience that we're calling national resilience. They are placing more and more emphasis on national resilience over market efficiency. So, if nothing else is clear in what I'm telling you today, just be aware that this concept of national resilience is very critical and that it is fluid, it is changing in very quick and dynamic ways. You can think of it as a part of, well, it is national security, but it's not the traditional sense of national security that most people understand. It's much more related to the economy and industrial strength than, say, military security. Governments have expanded their concept of national security in this way, and they're talking about resilience of industry. So I think we're going to talk about how it works in more detail a little later. But there are, as I mentioned, many types of tools, seizure adjacent tools that governments can and have been using. They can use emergency law, as in the case of British Steel. They can use the courts. The courts will maybe make use of some archaic or not maybe very rarely used act, as in the case of Nexperia, to suddenly take asset control away. In India, they have used financial enforcement against smartphone companies, and we can talk about that later. China is quite different from these cases because China has a very solid anti-security centric regime, which means that security is firmly embedded in China's approach to how foreign investors are allowed to access its markets. So there's, from the get-go, China has a myriad of rules that do intervene with the way that a foreign investor can use and access their assets. And a lot of times the foreign investor knows this going in, But that is fluid as well, and it can certainly change and become more restrictive or more constraining for that foreign investor after the fact, after they've already invested. That happens a lot in China as well. In the US and in Australia, there are different cases of how this could work. But the easiest one to talk about in the short space that I had in my paper was this concept of strategic proximity. So the US and Australia are defining national resilience in ways that secure their strategic infrastructure. In Australia, you've got controversy over Chinese ownership of the port of Darwin, for example. And in the US, there is still a lot of controversy over Chinese purchases of farmland, and especially farmland near military installations. So I grouped that type of tool as just to help folks understand and remember that in some cases it's really how close you are to sensitive infrastructure that matters. Okay, so we will move to the next slide. Live examples. This is ongoing. This is very dynamic. It is changing at a very rapid rate. I'm surprised that we aren't talking about it more because I think it is just that new and that quick. Since I sent in my paper for publishing. I think it was right before publishing, but after I finished the paper, there were a number of updates that were coming in to the information that even I had. And those updates, well, I didn't even get a chance in my paper to talk about Panama because I wasn't sure how it was going to go there. But you may remember all the reports about Panama canceling Hong Kong's firm CK Hutchison's 99-year lease of the Panama Canal. They have done that. The Supreme Court of Panama has done that just within the past few months. And they were at the time I last looked accepting bids from Maersk and MSC. These are Western aligned European companies from Norway and Italy as operators, as new operators. Now they were under pressure from Washington. I understand that, but this happened very quickly. Australia is still ongoing. There's a high chance, I think, that the Port of Darwin will come back under Australian ownership or operation, Australian operation and control. Japan, they have elected a new prime minister. She's taking a very hard line against China, for example, and she's beefing up their investment security and investment screening mechanisms. She's also, I think there was talk, I don't know if they got it passed or not, they're creating a new intelligence agency. There's a lot of talk about Japan and Germany remilitarizing, and this is going to mean also new, if they do what I believe that they are doing, this is going to mean a lot of risk in terms of whatever industries are aligned with their defense and national resilience priorities. And this is happening as I'm speaking now. So it's very volatile and it's hard to get your mind around it. And so I'm just trying to give you some principles and the framework for understanding how to look at some of these things. Risk, we can talk about that a little bit later, but there's a lot of risk for the global investment climate. There's fragmentation. These laws are all over the place. They are not harmonized. That means that the global investment system is balkanizing in a way, in inconsistent rules and regulations, which means less predictability. It also could mean narrower protections. Businesses are still protected. These are still rule of law societies for the most part, but the protections now are less given and they are narrower. There's the risk of a retaliation cycle between states, tit for tat, if you will, a regulatory lawfare or trade wars. one state moves too harshly against another state's investors, then there's going to be a response to that from another state. So there's that risk. And generally speaking, the system as it is now, already disrupted by geopolitics, you're going to find even more strain from these types of regulatory interventionist tools. So the hope is that we can govern this responsibly. We want to govern it proportionally. We want to be transparent about what's happening. But I think most important, we want to coordinate and try to find some way to create more harmonization across these jurisdictions so that, business can flow. So that is just my quick little slideshow in a nutshell. I hope you were able to follow along with that. You're free to have this slideshow, and again, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have either after this program or even in the upcoming weeks or months. If you have new questions, just find me, and I'll sit down and talk with you.
Thank you for that very interesting overview, Shannon, and for condensing what is a rather complex topic, so that our audience members can have a handle on what the key points are. I have a question regarding something you mentioned in your comments, as well as topic that's covered at length in the paper. The paper notes that outright confiscation of foreign-owned assets is rare in Western democracies, as developed countries tend to rely on ex ante and ex post intervention mechanisms. So I'd like to know, do you think that this is going to change and that we're going to see an uptick in seizures?
I'm going to distinguish between outright confiscations and the types of seizures that I discussed in my paper. We are now seeing a war in Iran. Outright confiscations tend to be more prevalent, or at least more common in a wartime era. We haven't seen anything like an uptick, really, unless you want to include what's happening with Russia and Europe and the discussion over seizure of assets there. Outright confiscation, which in legal terms, I guess you would call it expropriation. Politically, it's a nationalization. These have much higher legal thresholds. And they're also very controversial. They get a lot of press. They get a lot of negative feedback from the public and from the business community. So governments, especially pro-business, market economies, are hesitant, as they probably should be, to nationalize a firm. But what they haven't been hesitant to do recently is to use every available tool that they have to, how should I say, seize control in some shape or form, whether that's through locking down someone's access to funds, or perhaps changing the ownership of not the ownership, I'm sorry, the management of the firm for governance purposes. They will use whatever tools they have to take control over the asset if they think there's a threat to their national resilience. So in that respect, yes, I do say that I do think that there certainly appears to me to be an uptick already. And as long as the geopolitical environment remains volatile, and I don't see it calming down anytime soon, we've got two wars raging that are having a dramatic impact on Europe and the US. Where all these supply chains and assets are either managed or routing through. We're going to continue to see governments use the powers that they have to intervene in the ownership of that asset without changing the ownership, but to take some sort of control. We can talk about the different ways that they are doing that. I mentioned some already. I talked about the UK, how British steel in 2025, I don't know, October 2025 or something like that. There was a scramble at the last minute. So this is ex post. There was a scramble at the last minute to keep the UK's last blast furnace, Scunthorpe, I don't say that correctly, from closing down. Its Chinese ownership had been complaining and signaling for a while that they were struggling profit-wise. And I guess the UK government couldn't muster some sort. Well, I know that there were talks. I don't want to overstep what the government had tried to do up until that point. But it seems to me that this was a very reactive instead of a proactive approach to save at the very last second a firm that the UK identifies, obviously still making for Britain is very important to their national resilience. They need to be able to contribute to their alliances with other countries in wartime if and be able to produce steel for themselves. So this was a very just very quick emergency meeting, not unprecedented, but very, very rare, where parliamentarians were brought away from their families for a weekend session, very long weekend session, and they essentially stopped the Chinese owner from exercising control over the Scunthorpe plant. I said I would talk about India. India is very interesting. All of these cases are fascinating. I hope you get a chance to look some of them up in the news. But the India financial enforcement. So India is describing itself now as an alternative manufacturing hub for smartphones. So this is how India wants to present itself to the West. It wants to compete with China in that regard, and I believe it sees this industry as part of its national resilience. And it has a lot of talent, a lot of engineers, and it wants to make good use of that talent. So a few years ago, we had some Chinese smartphone companies who were prohibited by the Indian authorities from accessing the funds that they needed. Their funds were seized. These funds were they were alleged by the government, the British Indian government, to be illegal transfers. There were illegal transfers outside of India. I assume they were going to China. I don't remember where they were going. I think to China, back to China. And there were allegations of money laundering, and I think there were even criminal prosecutions in this case. But the Indian government stopped these firms from access to their bank accounts, or at least large, enormous sums of money that they needed for their day-to-day operations, although they were allowed some money for their daily operations. And the idea was that really there could have been some problem with how the transfers were being made outside of India, but also India is very sensitive about its smartphone industry, and you wouldn't normally think of smartphones as sensitive tech, right? But that's not what this is about. In one country, it might be sensitive tech. That's part of national resilience. But to another country like India, it's not the tech necessarily itself, but the industry, protecting this fledgling smartphone industry that it wants to use as a way to develop its economy. And so that became a very important part of what the government saw as as protecting national security. And that's why I wanted to make sure that we incorporate or included this example of India in my
Can
paper.
I ask, can I ask a question? Because I know your paper covers quite a number of countries, but there's a country that comes up an awful lot. That's China. You mentioned it two
Yeah.
times already in the examples you just gave. Why is China so often the target of seizures, financial enforcement, and other protective measures?
Well, China over the past 3 decades has become very, very embedded in the global economy in ways that other economies are now finding themselves unable to decouple from, so to speak. So there's a lot of over reliance, over dependence on China for many things. I can think of critical minerals, the refinement of critical minerals. You've seen that in the press. But there are other areas as well, like pharmaceuticals and other types of tech, like batteries and things like that. So China has become so integrated, and at the same time, there's an increase in the amount of rivalry with the US, strategic rivalry. A lot of that happened under Xi Jinping. He took a very hard right turn that many folks didn't expect. And so you see sort of a reckoning of, well, we sort of let all of our industrial strength be outsourced to China. And now there's a rush, I suppose, I think, a panic even to try to claw some of that back. It's not just the US, there's also Asia, Japan, South Korea, and there's Europe is now understanding what they've outsourced. So the fear is that another country, in this case China, can just simply turn off the tap in some way and disrupt, whether that's critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, whatever it is. So China, I am a China analyst. It makes it easy for me to look at. But it's a very important measure because China is still, we are not at war with China. This is a peacetime relationship that we have with China. And yet so you're seeing, instead of nationalization, instead of an outright confiscation, you're seeing governments still find ways to claw back control of their sensitive industries, whatever those are. Um,
And the
you,
follow-up,
yeah,
can I
go
ask a
ahead.
follow-up to that question? Sorry to cut you off, but I mean, and the reverse is also true. Your paper provides a number of examples in which US consultancies and due diligence firms operating in China were raided, penalized, and pressured as a means of controlling information flows. Can we expect more of that in this current political climate? And is it really a question of tit for tat or not?
I wouldn't call it tit for tat in this case. Not with the. I would say that China sees information security as a very essential part of its national resilience. Xi Jinping is a security man, so he focuses on security of everything. The things that we in the West don't consider sensitive, he does. There are political reasons for that. The Communist Party, for example, gets a lot of benefits, and some of those benefits might mean access to the best shares in Chinese companies. So then now you have vested interest, right, that are driving this sort of competition with other foreign competitors. And so a lot of this is maybe commercial protection by these political actors, but it can also be that Xi Jinping and his Beijing elite do not want Western firms or Western governments to have real and true information about the state of certain companies, the health of certain companies, because they're going to say that these companies are healthy and well as a measure of their economic growth when they're not. There are many reasons, but they don't like information, the information economy. China has never liked the information economy, and as long as the Chinese Communist Party controls it, it never will. So if the business model has to do with information, like in the case of Bain, who was a US consulting firm and doing its research into firms and the economic health of those firms, and the source of their capital and whatnot, well, they're they can run into problems with the authorities that way. Cap Vision, you saw that in the press. They have an expert network. Their expert network. Now, why are experts controversial in China? Because these are local Chinese experts, and these experts are moonlighting from their regular jobs as experts, and they may be moonlighting. Say they work at the state bank, or say they work, a lot of China's economy is still owned by the state. And so to make extra bucks on the side, these guys are going and talking to investors for a fee. All right. So Cap Vision was raided, and their computers and records and so forth were seized. I think the harshest example out of the three would be Mintz, which was a due diligence and investigations firm, a foreign due diligence and investigations firm, which ended up closing because they found the operating environment so inhospitable they could not continue that business model in China.
You say that most countries now rely on new generation investment treaties, but if other governments are calling special sessions to pass emergency laws on a piecemeal basis, as the UK did, and you mentioned in the 2025 Steel Act, can investors even invest with confidence?
Investors can still invest with confidence, but what investors cannot do is put on blinders to what's happening. They cannot say, this is just external geopolitics and it doesn't affect me. It absolutely can affect you, and it can affect you in ways that you don't realize until it's too late. Um, there are questions that every company should probably ask. They should probably ask, what does diversification mean to my firm and in my industry? So when Europe, for example, says it wants to diversify, not decoupling, well, what does that really mean in my industry and specifically for my firm? What do China's data security rules mean for my firm? So you're going to need to understand that everyone, not just China. China has always been tightening. There were periods of loosening, but they weren't that loose in relative terms. China is a very tight regime of rules, but now it seems that what was once considered very open Western economic practice is itself tightening. There are areas that are easily identified as sensitive. But the problem is those areas are changing, they're increasing, and you need to stay on top of it if you think that you are in an industry that has any kind of partner, foreign owner, um, link to a vulnerable supply chain, a link to a sensitive area of any sort. You've got to stay on top of it. Um, I would say that the legal frameworks still exist, but your emergency override risk is increasing, and the political discretion is expanding, and that does make it less predictable, especially in those areas that I just mentioned. So the biggest threat is that there's no absolute ownership protection. You don't, the concept of ownership itself is changing. And ownership, just because the state does not nationalize you and take your ownership away, if they are coming down hard on their national security risks, they may take control of your asset away. It's still a bit of an extreme instance. The cases that I mentioned in my paper, what is happening is that there was so much controversy over how these seizure tools were used that the states were trying to walk them back a little bit, right? But that still left a firm with either, in India's case, without funds for I don't know how many weeks and months, and in the case of Nexperia, the Dutch semiconductor manufacturer that was recently in the news. As far as I know, they still have an independent auditor running, controlling governance. They might have changed that. Everything is very dynamic and it changes very quickly.
My final question before we open up to our listeners, the questions from our listeners. You've touched on this somewhat, but can you expand and tell us a bit about the challenges that lie ahead? How can we ensure that de facto asset seizure is governed responsibly and predictably?
So, my paper was more or less about identifying this problem. I think you could write a book about the problem itself and then another book about how to go about solving it. The most important thing is to recognize that it's there. You can't do anything if you're just in panic mode and you don't realize what this is doing to the global investment economy. But another thing you can do is you can try to coordinate, right? We've got a lot of multilateral organizations, but they're not acting there might be forums for discussion, but principles of, they're not agents of change. You would need to coordinate at much higher levels to make sure something like the G7 or G20 or something like that, where economic issues are front and center and investment climate can be coordinated, or at least these issues can be discussed, and an attempt at harmonizing some sort of system to make the global economy great again, so to speak, uh, could be possible. So you can do that. You would want guardrails. Every state needs to think about proportionality. Is the exercise of control that we're taking, is it proportional to the threat? There's transparency. Don't do it, in the back room, and then just come out and, say, I'm sorry, you don't have control over your asset anymore. There needs to be a process, protocols that have very clear signaling to owners what's happening, why it's happening, what are your remedies at law, and let's sit down and talk about this. You need to have ways of preventing escalation and these retaliatory cycles. So you need to signal to the foreign government that this is not an attack on the government. This is just some way of trying to protect your own industry. You've got to find a way to do that. So there are a lot of ways you can go about addressing the biggest risks, but at least start by recognizing what's happening and get the topic out there and start discussing your options.
Great. Thank you. That's great. We have a question from Miriam, who is a foreign correspondent from Brazil. She would like to know, are journalists perhaps still covering these cases too narrowly as isolated disputes, when the more important story is that a new governance model may be emerging for strategic assets worldwide?
So probably yes. It's really tough because journalists are going to be keyed in to a specific jurisdiction, and they're covering news more locally, with one country, and this is a very macro view. This is a very macro look, right? So yeah, of course, it could be that. I just think that things are happening so quickly that no one's really had time to sort of connect the dots. I don't think I'm the first to connect the dots. I know that big law firms and big consultancies will have their lists of risk assessments and whatnot. But these things stay private. They stay within these firms. They don't often, very often, get published. So we need more journalists to cover these issues. We need more journalists to put it out into the public sphere so that the public is aware of what's happening and how that's going to impact their own economies at home, and their ability to get supplies from other countries and whatnot.
You. We've got another question from Stephanie, who's a foreign correspondent from Mexico. And she's asking if we are witnessing the end of the assumption that strategic assets can ever be truly private in periods of geopolitical rivalry.
Oh, that's a nice question. I like that one.
Isn't it?
The end of the assumption. Yes. Short answer, yes. In a geopolitically volatile world, yes. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that a sensitive, but the difficulty is knowing what's sensitive because that is changing so quickly. No one would really, it just not, it's not intuitive to think of a smartphone industry as being sensitive, but it's not sensitive because of the tech. In this case, it's sensitive because it's a way that India is going to feed some of its millions of people, right? They're trying to build an industry. So it's not just about tech. The strategic assessment it has to do with tech. It has to do with anything that governments feel insecure about. They're going to be much more willing to cross those market boundaries and intervene to protect their industries and whether that's tech or pharmaceuticals or whatever it is.
Pia Vasconcelos is asking if the geopolitical risk has become so embedded in investment policy that legal ownership is now secondary to political permission. What do you think about that?
No, I don't think so. Well, I guess the attorney's answer is it depends. It really depends on the context and the industry and the country, the government and the politics of that country. So you can't necessarily go that broad with that. It's not there yet. Ownership certainly is still primary in capitalist societies. China is not. China is a hybrid. And I say it that way because when you say it's a hybrid, people still look at China through a market economics lens. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. You won't understand what they're doing. You still have to look at China not through a communist lens, but through oppressive, authoritarian. I need control over every inch of my market, especially if I consider it sensitive. That's your lens for China. So, as far as the rest of the world goes, however, there's still very firm ownership rights in place. But understand that depending on what each country decides will make it resilient to these outside pressures, that those ownership rights can change. So you want to always go back to help you anchor this. Everything that I'm saying is just always go back to this concept. What in the country that I'm looking at, what is the national resilience concept that they're talking about? They may not use the word national resilience. They may call it national security, but it's very different from traditional concepts of national security.
Alex Urufoglu wants to know, does the China case suggest that the real sovereign power in the 21st century is not ownership of assets, but authority over the conditions under which assets can function?
I think that's accurate. I think it's China's always been, and that goes back to China. China ownership doesn't mean anything in a non-capitalist society. Ownership is a capitalism. It's a capitalist construct, right? So China will let you have your name on a piece of paper, no problem, and that doesn't mean anything. If the government decides it needs to intervene and take your asset or take control of your asset, they don't need to bother with changing the name on the paper. They just do what they need to do or do what they want to do. So, so I guess you could call, I wouldn't say China is the only country to do this, but they've been doing it longer, possibly, or more if you're operating in that environment more brazenly, outside of China, folks aren't really always focused on what's happening on that in that degree on China. But yeah, I think that's accurate. I think the other countries are kind of stepping up to say we want some of that control that China has, and this is how we're going to go about and get it in our rule of law societies and in our democracies. We're going to try to do it a legal way, and they do create new legal tools. Um, and they try to adhere to their constitutions. But there is certainly a different view of ownership rights in these cases. That's true.
Question myself. Um, do you expect the legal fragmentation created by what you call today's control without expropriation environment to limit or change the behavior of firms operating internationally? And if so, how?
Yes, they have to in order to protect themselves. So, um, you're going to see a shift from risk assessments that relate to market efficiency to risk assessments that relate to national security or national resilience. You need to see, they will need to make that leap. It's not what they do. They're not comfortable doing that. This is not really, it does have to do with investment security, but it's really as a political risk assessment versus an economic business assessment. So what does diversification mean for me and my industry? What does nearshoring mean for me and my industry and the supply chains? What does the volatility in the world mean for my company? If my company makes widgets for India's smartphone industry, should my company be outsourcing those widgets to China? Maybe not. Does that make sense? So everybody has their own risk, and every country has its own risk. So it gets difficult, but yeah, you have to stay on top of it. There are consultants, and there's news. Um, um, that is why it's a problem because it does put an awful big burden on businesses who are just supposed to be running their businesses. They're not accustomed to and comfortable with assessing political risk to semiconductor packaging in Europe. You know, I mean, can you outsource that to China? You got to start thinking about these things, right? So China's where everyone was outsourcing, and can they still do that? We saw this early on with the forced labor issues when everyone had the retail industries in Europe and in China, sorry, in the U.S. Were having to get their cotton from somewhere else because of the forced labor laws that the U.S. Passed, and were confiscating I don't know how many millions of dollars worth of products that were that the customs had decided were made from banned cotton from Xinjiang, right? So that was a supply chain issue for them, and so but it's also a political risk because the forced labor issue didn't take off until after COVID. China's been engaging in forced labor for decades. I mean, there's the Lao guy. So this is not a new thing for China, but it became a politicized supply chain before COVID. And the government was trying to get it off the ground, but then once COVID hit, it really accelerated. They were able to accelerate the laws, and so the fashion industry and clothing retailers and textiles all had this enormous disruption and change in the way that they managed their supply chains. And there was a lot of I guess that was a pretty rough time for everybody, and it still is. They have to charge more for clothing now. There's a lot of fallout even now from that.
Foundation said, Shannon, we love this paper so much. We want part two. We want you to take it forward. How would you build on the research that you've done? Where would you go?
There's so many cases out there. I'd be tempted to talk about those. I'd probably work a little bit harder on how to harmonize the rules. I am an attorney by training, and I study international business law and best practices in that. So I think I would try to write and research and talk to people and see how we can figure out a way to harmonize these very rapidly developing interventionist tools so that a firm that wants to invest in Germany can also invest in the US without so much headache and disruption and drama that the rules will to protect that firm's ownership and investment screening uh, would be a little bit more streamlined.
Situation is obviously very disturbing for companies all over the world. It's not, but yet it's not a topic that one reads about very often. Do you think that it's on the radar of policymakers, of governments, or how do you see this moving forward? I mean, is it going to be addressed, or is this a paper that you've done and we've all enjoyed, and then it hits the paper
That's
pile?
right, right. I certainly think that there's been so much controversy with the Nexperia case that Europe or the Netherlands is going to take another look and see how they can do things better. I don't know if any of the other jurisdictions have recognized that or not. It's I know that I feel confident that there's a push among businesses and investors for greater predictability, greater confidence. So that push will likely eventually work its way up to multilateral organizations. But no, I think we're at the everything is happening too fast, right? And so we're so busy reacting and dealing with these volatile geopolitical conditions that no one has had time yet really to step back and look at the mess that we're creating for cross-border businesses. Um, so we're at the very cusp of the trend. I don't want to say that. This has been happening for at least 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer. But we're at the cusp of maybe finding a solution, I believe. Yeah. So I think the push will come from the investment community. It needs to come from there because they are stakeholders, and the countries will start to see investments decline if there's no confidence.
Was going to be another question as far as where the impetus was going to come from. And do you see geographically where it will come from? I mean, those investors, will that be Western, Eastern, Southern, Northern, all over?
Well, probably all over, but it will probably from the West. The West is so used to having an easier time of cross-border operations, especially, the transatlantic business community. But that's going to be disrupted if you've got uh, companies in, well, that's exactly what happened with Nexperia. Nexperia is a Dutch semiconductor manufacturer that was working its business the way it felt that it should. When I say Dutch, it had a major Chinese shareholder, so it was registered in Dutch, but the shareholder is Chinese, and the the executive, I'm sorry, wait, not executive, the CEO, I don't know what he was called, and I can't remember his name. He's a Chinese national, and he had been communicating apparently that he wanted to move operations to China, right? And then other shareholders or employees in the company, managerial staff, I'm not sure which, decided to let the Dutch government know about that. So, but it wasn't really the Dutch government that kicked the case into high gear. It was actually pressure from DC. And these companies, especially a semiconductor manufacturer, so used to being able to, because they're so high tech, they're so used to being able to operate the way they need to or want to as going concern that I'm not sure that they've properly assessed the political environment. And so when Washington came in and started pressuring the Dutch government, that's when the case sort of exploded. So the disruption, the chances for disruption these days is so much higher than it was in the past. And that's just where we keep ratcheting up in terms of the geopolitical climate. We just everything seems to escalate. I don't want to be doom and gloom. We need strong leaders to help us de-escalate. But right now, things, even with the Iran war, right, that's going to have an impact on supply chains. Not just oil. It could be fertilizers. It could be a lot of things that are coming out of that Strait of Hormuz.
As you say, it's all a question of geopolitical and global volatility, and it doesn't seem like anything's getting less volatile.
No,
So
it would be nice. We could all use a break, I think. I
I,
certainly could,
I,
but I don't see it yet. So I don't know what will
yes,
happen
yeah,
uh,
I think
to
you're
bring it
right.
back down.
Well, yeah, well, as the old saying goes, time will tell. Um, and I think that pretty much wraps up, unless there's anything else you wanted to say, Shannon.
I think there was one quick thing. I thought that it was very interesting. If I have it here, if I can find it. Um, I just want folks going forward, if you want to focus, if you want to see this trend in action, you can obviously you can follow the cases that I laid out in the paper. But if you want to see these newer cases and you start to get a sense for what's happening, so continue to follow the Australia land bridge, the Port of Darwin case. This is happening as we speak. So the government has not taken, they have not canceled Landbridge's contract, but there's plenty of discussion about it. And China is getting angrier and angrier. And I think the last thing I read probably a few weeks ago was that they had threatened countermeasures if anything happens to that contract. So that's an interesting thing, an interesting one to watch. But watch what's happening with Japan and Germany. It's remarkable, you know. Things are taking a very different turn. They are. Germany just passed, I don't know, a very almost unprecedented, I suppose, defense budget. So they are beefing up, and every time they beef up, that's just a signal, right? That national security is being taken very seriously. And not only that, they're going to broaden, generally speaking, the trend is to broaden those definitions of what is national security. And economic resilience is core to national security these days.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you, members of our audience. And again, Shannon has shown you or explained to you how you can get a hold of her for any follow-up questions and to obtain the paper. Once again, I'd like to repeat that this educational program is presented in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, and the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA is solely responsible for the development of the contents of this program. Thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you again another time. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.